The point is, if you're going to walk into that theater, you better be willing to sit down and work through these things and do it from a biblical perspective.
That's why family movie night is so powerful. We do a movie night at camp, at Worldview Academy leadership camps, wherever we are. One of the stock lectures is we show film clips. With alumni, we'll go through an entire film. And inevitably, after camp, we get feedback from parents, and they say, "You have ruined movie night for our family." Thank you. They say thank you, because they'll say, we're watching a film, and our student who's gone through Worldview Academy will say, "Stop it, pause it right there. Did you see the worldview?"
Yeah, but you do that and you break the spell.
Yeah.
You drop off the movie.
Exactly.
You bring it to a screeching halt. You break the spell, and now you're going to have to think through it.
Not feel your way through it.
Not feel your way through it, but think your way through it.
Yeah.
And, but that's just not the way the Americans do it. So, Bill, wow, it's so important for us to be able to discern movies, and it's a sneaky thing. It's not always easy. And I'm guessing that there's a percentage of people listening to my opening comments, and they're thinking, what did he just say? Now, if you're asking that question, you probably need to study this a little bit before you just jump into that theater and just absorb everything that's coming at you. We're not just counting cuss words here. We need to get down into the foundational issues relating to ethics, the metaphysic that's concerned, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not sure people are quite ready for that as they enter the theater.
And it's a worldview issue. Everybody understands that stories, novels, short stories there's an element called a perspective. Everybody has a point of view. The author has a point of view he's trying to get across. That also applies to film. Okay, and with film, it's one of the most powerful teaching tools in the culture.
By far.
It includes the visual, it includes the dialogue, it includes the music. So all of that's wrapped together, and you tend to give your heart to it.
Yeah.
And once you give your heart to something, if someone criticizes it, you therefore have to defend it. We feel our way through a film rather than think our way through a film. Now, what's fascinating about this is that in the early 1900s, when film became popular, the Catholic priests began to address movies during Mass, to the point where the Catholic groups began to organize in leagues of decency. There was a Supreme Court case in 1915, Mutual Film Corporation versus Industrial Commission of Ohio. And in that decision, the Supreme Court ruled that free speech did not extend to motion pictures, and therefore what happened is states began to introduce censorship legislation. Hollywood got the message. They began to court the Catholic Church specifically because they had set up these leagues of decency. Priests were addressing motion pictures, warning their congregants not to go to certain films. And so what was born out of that was the Motion Picture Production Code. It was a voluntary thing. It was often called the Hays Code because Will Hays was president of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America from 22 to 1945. And it was a voluntary thing, and they would submit their films voluntarily to a commission from the Catholic Church who would review and then make suggestions. They would actually change scripts so that they would take out not just what we would consider sexually explicit now. It was just anything that was suggestive, anything that glorified rather than vilified sin or criminal behavior. And Hollywood did this voluntarily. In fact, one Catholic priest said that he remembered that, he said, I grew up with a legion of decency because on the first Sunday after the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, the priest would ask us all to stand and take the Legion of Decency pledge. You want to hear the pledge?
Yeah, what was the pledge? Yeah. Now, this is to say this is the Catholics.
Yes.
And the evangelicals and Protestants had nothing to do with it.
They turned a blind eye because we retreated from culture.
Right.
We can't retreat from culture. That's why this is a worldview issue, because it's the most powerful teaching tool in the culture.
Right.
We're ignoring it until recently.
Well, until the program today. We're airing a program on this.
there are Christian filmmakers who are doing an excellent job.
Right. Okay.
But, I mean, when I grew up, the only thing we had for Christian films were the Billy Graham heavy-handed gospel presentations, right? So here's the pledge that you would take.
Okay.
I condemn all indecent and immoral motion pictures and those which glorify crime and criminals. I promise to do all that I can to strengthen public opinion against the production of indecent and immoral films and to unite with all who protest against them. I acknowledge my obligation to form a right conscience about pictures that are dangerous to my moral life. I pledge myself to remain away from them. I promise further to stay away altogether from places of amusement which show them as a matter of policy.
Yeah,
now,
that's a pretty strict
the only group of people
code.
that I'm aware outside the Catholics who did this, my grandmother was Pentecostal. Mm-hmm. They were death on going to a movie.
On all movies.
On all movies, and what we would call fundamentalists, okay?
Right.
Though, until TV came out. And when TV came out and the movies that were shown in theaters began to be shown in their living rooms, suddenly it was a different story.
Yeah. And that would have been the 1960s, 1970s.
Yes.
Right.
This code was enforced from 1934 until 1968. In the mid-60s, it began to lose its clout. Mm-hmm. Hollywood began to ignore Christians because Christians walked away. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that Hollywood said, we're not going to thumb your nose. They walked away.
What's interesting now is we have this new opportunity. Independent filmmakers, guys like us that do this little thing in our basements or wherever we are making an impact on the ideas, the idea exchange, the conversation that's going on in terms of worldviews as it affects the culture. And to me, we have a tremendous opportunity. I'm thankful for every Christian film producer that's out there and bringing
brothers and,
a distinctive Christian worldview into the area of film or any form of media.
And you're seeing a clear division in what people want. Hollywood celebrates the ambiguity of morality.
Which is what we just talked about.
You just talked about that. Mm-hmm. They celebrate the perverse. They attack the virtuous. They attack Christianity. Whereas Christian filmmakers are now producing quality films that are drawing families and drawing money away from Hollywood. And now Hollywood has to take notice. As you said, Hollywood's losing money, but they don't care. They really don't care. What they care about is forcing their worldview of moral relativism onto the American public. Christians need to invade every aspect of culture, from the arts to science, from philosophy to politics. Because we are to have dominion. We are to inform from a biblical worldview every aspect of culture.
Well, by the time you get to the 1960s, you start to see these radical revolutionary moves. In fact, I would say The Graduate of 1967, remember Mrs. Robinson, the song sung by Simon and Garfunkel, as I recall.
Yep.
We begin to see...
Do you want me to sing a few bars of that?
No, thank you.
Okay.
We begin to see a radical, revolutionary view when it comes to sexuality. I mean, there you get an excellent example of adultery, and it is somewhat accepted. You're getting to the point at which you're allowing for the protagonist in the film to be somebody who's breaking God's law, but doing so with impunity.
Right.
And this is a shift. This is a massive shift that's occurring. Bonnie and Clyde. 1967. Outlaws. There are unwarranted scenes going on here. Midnight Cowboy. Some call it the first X-rated film of the modern era. So this is all part and parcel of the sexual revolution that's exploding on the scene. The contribution of Hollywood and the contribution of Nashville and the music industry, the pop music industry, is probably the most significant and powerful demonic force that's changing the mind and the culture of the American society.
Right.
I mean, who else would be doing it? It wasn't like Richard Nixon was changing the morality of the nation. Well, he didn't help.
Right.
But it wasn't like he was driving this vehicle. This is happening through Hollywood. It's happening through The Graduate, Bonnie and Clyde, Easy Rider, Midnight Cowboy. These are the movies that are revolutionary. They're changing the whole environment.
So is Hollywood and the educational system.
Well, that's happening at the same time, sure, because they've taken prayer out of the schools, et cetera. But when it comes down to it, you and I both know that the primary influence on the morality of a culture is going to be pop culture. It's going to be the movie theater. They led America by the nose into this moral revolution.
Unfortunately, Christians are always behind the curve. They're playing catch up, and Christians have not addressed this from a worldview perspective. For example, The Lion King, when it came out, it was touted by Christian organizations, including Focus on the Family, as the film that families should go support because there were no curse words in it, no scenes of anybody smoking cigars, for example. You know, it was great, and they missed the entire worldview that was being promoted in this whole idea of the circle of life. And it was a reincarnationist, it was an Eastern mystic worldview. Eastern mysticism was touted. You become one with the universe, you reincarnate, and you see it throughout the film, and yet they didn't Focus on the Family and other Christian organizations did not address that. They were just concerned about the surface. You know, there's no sex, there's no drugs, there's no rock and roll kind of thing, okay? And they miss the entire worldview. And so I still talk to students whose younger siblings have watched Lion King, and when I point out the worldview, I said, you may be astute enough to recognize this worldview, but your 6-year-old sister or brother is not astute enough. And they memorize the songs, and it begins to have an impact in their thinking.
Bill, do you think that the church should be willing to step in and do some movie reviews? Do you think the pastors of a church should step in and say, you know what, guys, when the heroes or heroines are vampires, witches, homosexuals, and bank robbers, it's hard to commend them even when they save the damsel in distress. And that's a comment I make in my book, To Tattoo Jesus, what the real Jesus would do with pop culture. Hunger Games. Another example of you know, a moral relativism that's attempted. It's attempted.
The movies are geared toward tweens, not teenagers, but younger.
They tend to be.
They tend to be geared, and so they're setting the standard. They're setting the bar. They're laying the foundation for these worldviews to be adopted later in life, and so you end up with confusion among Christian teens who are trying to figure out what is right and what is wrong.
You know, I have an extensive thing on the Hunger Games in my book, The Tattoo Jesus. While Scripture does allow some violence for the sake of self-preservation, the preservation of the lives of others is a higher value. Therefore, we find Abraham defending the life of Lot. We find Moses defending the life of a fellow Israelite, etc. But in the case of the Hunger Games, two deleterious and tyrannical conditions are placed upon the combatants simultaneously. First, the civil magistrate has deputized a citizen to kill other innocent citizens, none of whom have been convicted of a crime. Secondly, the civil magistrate has deputized others to kill the same citizen. Now, what is the proper ethical response to this? And I took my daughter to this film because a lot of her friends were attending this, and then we came back home and we worked through this ourselves. In fact, we did this on the program itself. So what is the proper ethical response? Well, first, the magistrate the Christian must never murder innocent human beings, even though the magistrate may require it of him or her. So this is the classic story of, you know, the Nazis saying, okay, shoot the Jews here. You know, if they're commanded to do so by a magistrate, they are still to disobey. The Hebrew midwives in Exodus 1:14-22 serve as our example here. It's clearly testified of them in the historical record that these women feared God more than they feared the king, and they are commended for it. Second, the Christian may not kill the deputized magistrate, although she may attempt to flee in order to protect her own life. David serves as an example here. In this scenario, on more than one occasion, he had the opportunity to kill Saul and his deputies as they hunted him down, yet he refused to touch the the Lord's anointed, 1 Samuel 24, 1-10. So I give an example of how to work out this quote unquote, relativistic ethical conundrum that is placed upon, as you said, 12-year-olds, which is kind of a shameful thing. Throw a 12-year-old into the midst of that and have them work out an ethical conundrum that, guys with masters in divinities or masters in biblical ethics are going to, have to grapple with a little bit.
But see,
to work through it. The point is, if you're going to walk into that theater, you better be willing to sit down and work through these things and do it from a biblical perspective.
That's why family movie night is so powerful. We do a movie night at camp, at Worldview Academy leadership camps, wherever we are. One of the stock lectures is we show film clips with alumni. We'll go through an entire film, and inevitably after camp, we get feedback from parents, and they say, "You have ruined movie night for our family. Thank you." They say thank you because they'll say we're watching a film, and our student who's gone through Worldview Academy will say, "Stop it, pause it right there. Did you see the worldview?"
Yeah, but you do that and you break the spell.
Yeah,
you drop off the movie.
Exactly.
You bring it to a screeching halt. You break the spell, and now you're going to have to think through it,
not feel your way through it,
but think your way through it. And but that's just not the way the Americans do it.
But we should.
Yeah. Oh, I know.
Because we are to take every thought captive,
including the thoughts that are generated in Hollywood movie theaters, or movie studios and such. Well, friends, we got to wrap this thing up, but I'd recommend to you The Tattooed Jesus, what the real Jesus would do with pop culture, and I would recommend Apostate, The Men Who Destroyed the Christian West. One of the reasons for that is because this recent movie that's just come out as one of the key Academy Award winners for the 2026 Academy Award ceremonies is this movie called Sinners. And in this movie called Sinners, it turns out that what is preferred is an African spirituality, more authentic, more pure, more freeing than the stiff, world-denying legalism of Christian religion. And so again, it's the hoodoo princess. It's the hoodooism. It's the murderers. It's the adulterers that are preferred over this narrow, legalistic, white-dominating kind of Christianity. And when I read that review of the Academy Award-winning movie Sinners, I got to thinking of Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. Mm-hmm. Because Hawthorne's real sin, as he defines sin, was that he would not acknowledge the sin of witchcraft as a true violation of God's law. As a humanist who thought and acted independently of God's law, he was accusing the Puritan magistrates of injustice by his arbitrary humanist standards. Occasionally, he tried to explain away all supernaturalism with scientific naturalism, but woven into his stories is this surreptitious implication that the sin of witchcraft, homosexuality, adultery, or incest were more acceptable than whatever the Puritans were doing during America's early days. And that's the way humanists and liberal thinkers operate. And that's the way they've operated since Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. There should be little debate on the central moral thrust of the Scarlet Letter, for example, because at the end, of course, what we have is a pitting of the Dimsdale character against the Hester character. Dimsdale character self-atones for his sin, whereas the Hester's character gets away with it, and she moves on to excusing her adultery in her later years. And so you have this conflict. You have this horns of a dilemma again between the two characters. Jesus, of course, never shows up. There is no redemption. There is no gospel, none of that. But at the end of the story, 3 times, the author of the story, Nathaniel Hawthorne, says the whole idea is to be true, be true, be true. It's the highest ethic for the humanist. There's nothing here about obeying God, believing in Jesus, loving God with heart, soul, mind, and strength. The humanist ethic is simply don't hide who you are. Be yourself. Be true to yourself. If you're a cannibal or a murderer or adulterer, just admit the fact. Don't pretend to be somebody that you're not. Huckleberry Finn is another example I give in my book, Apostate, The Men Who Destroyed the Christian West, where Mark Twain puts Huck Finn on the horns of a dilemma. Again, either he must support slavery or he must oppose the Christian God and go to hell. Now, we understand what the Bible actually says about slavery and explain that in my book, Apostate, The Men Who Destroyed the Christian West, but this is effectively what Mark Twain does. He creates one of the most powerful apologetics against the Christian faith that the world has ever known. It's, by the way, still using to this day. So at first, Huck thinks he should turn over his escaped slave friend Jim to the authorities, but then he decides against it. In this pivotal scene from the book, Twain depicts the American Christian God as a pro-slavery villain who would have Huck surrender his friendship for the cause of slavery. So this contempt that Mark Twain holds for the Christian God, inescapable. Huck makes up his religion as he goes along. It's sometimes dualistic, sometimes agnostic. As the story plays out, Huck is particularly given to the sins of cursing, blasphemy, dishonor of parents, stealing, lying, etc., all presented as something that is kind of cool for Huckleberry Finn. The other characters in the story adopt different religions or religious perspective. Tom Sawyer believes the Bible is a bunch of fairy tales. Mary Jane is the most genuine believer in the story, though still misguided according to Huck's perspective. Uncle Silas and Aunt Sally are well-meaning Christians who support slavery and dehumanize the African Americans with their language. Huck's father's an unbeliever, an abusive drunk, and a scofflaw. Huck's friend Jim practices a religion that mixes pagan animism with Christianity. But the Christian family that best represents the historical American family is the Grangerfoot family, chapters 17 and 18. Huck meets this family on his way down the Mississippi River. They're presented as church members, and their home library consists of the Bible and Pilgrim's Progress and a hymnal. And these nice Christian families attend church on Sunday mornings, and then they murder each other on Sunday afternoon. And despite the fact that the old matriarch spends most of the day reading the Bible, this family engages in murderous activities on a regular basis. So Mark Twain's worldview, he considered the Bible as a repository of a blood-drenched history and a wealth of obscenity and well unto 1,000 lies. That's the way he looked at the Bible. And so the Grangerford family activities were obviously inspired by these scriptures. And Mark Twain's views are very much expressed in Huckleberry Finn. So what we find with the modern Hollywood movies, like what we find with Sinners, is a replay of what we find in Huckleberry Finn and the Scarlet Letter, where these authors that have apostatized from the Christian faith present a straw man version of Christianity, and then they burn the straw man down. And this becomes the measure. I'm talking about a very, very powerful apologetic against the Christian faith for generations of kids that apostatize from the Christian faith in liberal arts schools, colleges and high schools across America for the last 180 years.
Kevin, I think there's one last thing we need to talk about here. And it goes to the comment by John Molderig, who's from the Catholic News Service, who reviews these films. And he said, I think it's helpful that we're engaging with film in the overall assessment of, is this film one that upholds gospel values or contradicts gospel values? That's the grid through which we should filter everything, whether we're reading it or seeing it or hearing it.
My friends, that's the way it works. And I explain it in Apostate, the Men Who Destroyed the Christian West. And by the way, to properly understand the movies, encourage you to The Tattooed Jesus, What the Real Jesus Would Do with Pop Culture. Both books available at generations.org. This is Kevin Swanson and Bill Jack inviting you back again next time as we continue to lay down a vision for the next generation. This has been a production of the Generations Media Network. For more information, go to generations.org/media.